Do your best, C.S. Lewis.
I allowed myself to prepare for confirmation, be confirmed, and make my first communion all in total disbelief, acting a part, eating and drinking my own condemnation, he says.
It's a great moment in the film. I really enjoyed that.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Hello and welcome to this week's Profile with me, Justin Brierley, brought to you as ever in partnership with Premier Christianity magazine, the monthly mag with the best Christian journalism, interviews, news and features out there. You can get a free sample copy at the website premierchristianity.com/free sample, and also see the great subscription offer they have on at the moment. Today on the show, I'm talking with Max McLean, star of the new C.S. Lewis movie, The Most Reluctant Convert. Max, welcome along. It's so good to have you with me. Let me do a little introduction to you first of all. You are the founder and artistic director of the Fellowship of Performing Arts, I think based out in New York, but known all over the world for your productions, including, of course, many based on the writings and life of C.S. Lewis. And a new movie had just been released, The Most Reluctant Convert. We're going to be talking about that today, and I believe being shown across the USA in theatres and things like that. So welcome along to the show, Max.
Thank you, Justin. I think this is the second time you've had me, I believe.
I think it is. I think we last connected, around the time that you were in London doing a performance of the Screwtape Letters, which I attended with my family, and we really enjoyed it. It was, I got a feeling it was something like Christmas 2017, maybe?
16, I think. 16 or 15, somewhere there. Yeah, it's been a while.
Okay, that long ago. There you go. I mean, and that alone sort of shows the way that you've been involved for so long in doing plays, productions around the writings and life of C.S. Lewis. Tell us, Max, before we get into this, the new movie. Did you grow up kind of with a love of acting? Was that something that was there right from the beginning?
No. I'm an immigrant. I came to America via the Statue of Liberty when I was 4 years old. In fact, we came in at the West Side Passenger Terminal, which happens to be about a 10-minute walk from where I currently live in Midtown Manhattan. So the first thing I had to do was master the English language. I've been working on it ever since. My first involvement in theater was really in college, and that was to get over a fear of public speaking, sociophobia. So that's how I got into the theater.
There you go. So it was actually to overcome the nerves of speaking in public, and now it's more or less all you do for a living.
It's all I do, yeah.
Tell us about your Christian journey, though. Did that go hand in hand with getting into acting and drama?
Well, that's very interesting because I started acting in my senior year of college, about 22 years old, and then I had an adult conversion experience about a year later at 23. And it was meeting a woman who, if I wanted to be with her on Sunday, I would have to attend church. A very odd experience. But what was not odd was, the worship experience was odd, except for some reason the Lord's Prayer that had a haunting effect because I knew it, and so that had an effect. And then met some of her friends who I graduated from college with a history degree, and one of her friends mentioned that, Jesus was a person in history just like Lincoln, just like George Washington. Well, that was news to me because I thought Jesus was fairy tales. And for some reason, that little twist, opened my mind to want to read the gospel. I've tried to read it in the past, but didn't get anywhere. And the person of Jesus just overwhelmed me. And so my conversion came right around that time.
Wow. That would be an interesting film in itself, I imagine. But you've obviously devoted so much of your life in a way to telling the story of C.S. Lewis and obviously producing his works as well. When do you first remember bumping into the works of C.S. Lewis, Max?
Well, this person who I was attracted to, Sharon, who later became my wife, I had the conversion experience. I'd read the New Testament. I had the year prior read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which had a huge impact on me. I don't know why, but I mean, it just hit me in a very deep place. And now I do know why, because it's probably the greatest Christian novel ever written. But I had no experience with C.S. Lewis. So she thought, I must be, I would be into him. So she gave me a copy of Surprised by Joy. I was 23 years old. I read it from cover to cover, and I must say, I don't think I understood a word of it. It went by me like a freight train. But I knew I was up against a massive intellect. And I said, I don't think this is it. And I didn't get it. And he says, well, try this one. And it was the Screwtape Letters. And from page one, the man in the British gets on the bus in the British Museum. I said, I know this guy. This guy is, this guy has been in my life, and so, Lewis's transparency, his, he deals with sin at the greed, at the spite level, and so, he's not after, other people's sins, crimes of humanity and all that. He's like, what did you do today that was so hurtful, spiteful and mean? And I said, okay. Yeah. So that was my first introduction.
I was going to say, in that sense, you went straight to the meat, in the sense that a lot of people, obviously, their first introduction to Lewis is the Narnia stories. I mean, had you come across those at that point?
No, I hadn't even heard of them. So so they I was never much attracted to, at least I don't recall attracted to fantasy very much. So anyway, yeah.
There you go. So as your own faith developed, you obviously eventually founded the Fellowship of Performing Arts. What took you on that journey? Did you feel that there was a need to see the Christian faith given this kind of a way of expression, through the dramatic arts and so on?
Yeah, it was sort of a backdoor thing because, I did not grow up in the evangelical church, so I didn't get the memo that Christians weren't supposed to be actors. And yet, I went to drama school in London, and I went to the National Theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, to the Old Vic, the Royal Court, on an absolutely regular basis, and my imagination was constantly being engaged, and I also, as a new Christian, I was really sensitive to Christian themes, in all of these works. And so the idea just popped into my head, why aren't Christians doing this? And they were. I mean, there was a group called Upstream that I think was doing really good work back then, in late 70s, but not in America, at least not that I was aware of. And so the idea of fellowship for performing arts emerged. Why not use the skills and techniques developed in the theater to present this worldview? And so that was the germ of the idea, and I was able to get people to support the idea, and that's where fellowship began.
Yeah, and I think, frankly, one of the reasons it has been so successful and has gone around the world, Max, is because you do it well, and that's not true of all art produced under the Christian banner, because sometimes, sadly, it can just mimic the world and do a fairly substandard job of it, can't it? Whereas we used to have, it appears, Christian art simply was the art of its time, and so Michelangelo, anyone was, it was sublime.
Yeah.
What happened? How do we kind of get back, if you like, to art that really is creative, engaging, aesthetically beautiful, that really honors God in that sense?
Well, one of the things is that, it all begins with the church, and the church in the main doesn't produce artists, or at least it didn't. It's starting to now. I mean, it certainly produces musicians. Every time I watch The Voice or America's Got Talent, or you're seeing all of these people coming out of the church. So musically, that's still the case. We produce some of the best, but theatrically, there's been such a suspicious element to it, and probably rightfully so. I mean, you probably know that actors were not given burial rights. Augustine had horrible things to say about the theater. So that has a long tradition for that, and then of course the way it was redeemed was for some kind of evangelistic purpose, agenda-driven purpose. Now, mind you, all art has an agenda. There's nothing. It's not agenda-free. But the question is how do you articulate that agenda? And so what Fellowship was trying to do was we wanted to. Our mission was produce theater from a Christian worldview meant to engage a diverse audience. So it's a simple mission. And in order to do that, you had to select the right material. What material would at least gain the respect, of the argument of the audience, and then you'd have to execute at the highest levels that your budgets will allow, so you can play the greater venues around the country. Because we made it a point not to play churches. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we wanted to play in the marketplace of ideas where the other places were. And so to get the production values up there was really, really important. And then of course we asked people to help us do it, and so that's why we're a fellowship for performing arts. It's a fellowship of people who believe art and theater from a Christian worldview can engage the imagination and influence culture.
Well, let's talk about The Most Reluctant Convert. So I think you've produced a number of different productions that are related to Lewis. When did you decide to actually produce a stage play that would reflect his own conversion experience?
It began after adapting Screwtape Letters and adapting The Great Divorce from the page to the stage. Both of those works have to do with spiritual warfare, temptation, kind of sins of commission and resisting the conscience, resisting the Holy Spirit, sins of omission. And in both cases, Lewis was so transparent about it. And so he was using his own personal experience, his own emotional autobiography. And so with that in mind, we've done the two. I said, well, Lewis is always going back to his conversion, the time where he was just resisting, fighting. So that got me back to Surprised by Joy. And what I ended up doing was I didn't know, not that I knew Screwtape would be, or even The Great Divorce. I didn't think either one of those, they weren't obviously theatrical material, but they did, if you worked at it and found the theatrical arc to it, you could get there. So I did try to do the same thing with Surprised by Joy. And actually that was actually simpler because, it's a change story, once I was this, I was that. And what I ended up doing, and, people say that, for playwrights, if you really want to understand a playwright, you actually copy it out and try to figure out why he went this way instead of this way. So I actually did that with Surprised by Joy and got really inside it. And from that, I was able to craft, after many, many, many attempts and lots of development. In 2016, we did a stage production of it that ran in New York for 15 weeks and plays at colleges and universities all over the country. We had a really good run with it. Of course, with the pandemic, it just shut down. But that was the history of Most Reluctant Convert.
How many people before the pandemic shut it down? How many people had it played to by that point?
I would say roughly 100,000 people had seen it.
Wow.
In one way. We had some 200 different performers, but more than that, around the country. And then, the pandemic just shut us down. We had 2 shows on tour. Most Reluctant Con was doing around the colleges, and then we had a show in New York. We had a modern adaptation of Paradise Lost, and all of that went from going 100 miles an hour to 0, just like that. It was like you hit a wall.
Yeah. Well, we know the devastating effect that the pandemic has had on the theatre and performing arts world, and you were no different in that sense. And many of those venues and companies only really just starting to claw their way back now. But I mean, you pivoted, quite quickly actually, because it was this film idea, converting the stage play into a film. Was that something you already had on the agenda, or was that something that was a kind of fruit of the lockdown experience?
Well, Norman Stone, who directed the piece, and you probably should say a little word about him, but he's a terrific filmmaker, has 40 years experience with the BBC and many others, a couple of Emmy Awards, a couple of BAFTA Awards. He and I met at an arts conference about 10 years ago, and we hit it off right away. We have a similar vision about what we want to do in film and art. And about in the fall of 19, I called him and said, this stage play is doing really well. Would you consider having a conversation about making a film of it? And he said, well, let me see the script. So I sent him the script. He loved the script. And so we started having conversations. And in January of 2020, we made an agreement that he would do the kind of research that would be able to get us to a treatment that we could put a budget behind and decide to film it. But in my idea, that was going to be, 2022, 23 project. It was not anything immediate. And plus we just had so many things going on. Sure. And then with the shutdown, of course everybody thought it was going to be short term. At least we did, I don't know if you remember 15 days to flatten the curve. And I thought, what am I going to do for the next 2 weeks? And then all of a sudden it just got longer and longer. So sometime, and Norman and I were having regular conversations over Zoom and Skype. He lives in Scotland, I live in New York. And I think sometime in June, he said, if, the British film industry is going to open back up in August under very strict conditions, and he could get a very good crew together and get a very good cast because nobody had worked since March. And if we were prepared to act now, and I said, well, I asked him to confirm all that and then make sure the locations we needed were available. And I would go to the board and see if I could get the funding to put it in the can, right? And we worry about post-production and distribution later, but just get it in the can. We got the rights from C.S. Lewis Estate shortly thereafter, have a good relationship with them. And I remember on August 31st of 2020, I got on a plane as big as Air Force One with fewer people on it from Newark to Heathrow. Went into quarantine for 2 weeks, began filming mid-September, finished filming mid-October, and came back, and here we are a year later.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I remember the Facebook updates. We're friends on Facebook, Max, and obviously you sort of, it was great to see the way it unfolded. It looked terribly exciting when I was seeing you in various parts of Oxford filming, and then I realised Michael Ward, who's a mutual friend of ours, was he's a brilliant C.S. Lewis scholar, but also has a penchant for a bit of acting himself, and was playing the part of the Church of England vicar, and so it all looked great fun, and I'm just stunned that it came together so quickly. Though it's almost miraculous. These things never come together that quickly. Normally,
well, part of it, Norman works extraordinarily fast, and because he sees everything in his head. He sees the pictures, and we already had the script was already because it's been fine-tuned from all these theatrical productions. So those two things were there. And then, we had to take one of the things we had to do was take COVID tests like all the time. And they were just so, gosh, it was so tedious. And anyway, but any one of those tests, I mean, we had 17 actors, 190 extras. So if an extra got a positive test, it probably wouldn't have done much. But if I got a positive test, or Norman, or if the cinematographer, it would have shut us down for weeks. And, and we would have just sat there and waited. And I don't know what would have happened, because shortly thereafter, like in mid-October, like by the end of November, there was a second wave came and they shut down filming again. So we probably wouldn't have been able to finish the film. Yeah. So it certainly has a providential element running right through it.
Tell us about the film then, because obviously shooting a film is very different to putting on a stage play, which is essentially a one-man stage play to a large degree. This obviously involves multiple characters and so on. You're still very much Lewis, but the older Lewis narrating. And I've had the pleasure of seeing the film and I really loved it. Fantastic film. It was just so good. And it strikes me that the script itself draws from all kinds of, at points I was like, ooh, now this is Surprised by Joy, and ooh, now this is from this other. So tell us about how the script itself came together, what that was like, then turning that into something that was obviously shot for a movie instead.
Well, the script emerged primarily from Surprised by Joy. But it also had many other sources. The Problem of Pain, like the opening chapter, when I was an atheist. So you get this empirical view of the experience of being on this planet alone and just looking out. The universe is dark, cold, empty space. I mean, that's our empirical experience. So if you just use that, that's what you see. And so we start from that, Lewis's empiricism, and he comes to it, and then you get he begins to play with the statement, I think, of brilliant poetic prose. Either there's no God behind the universe, a God indifferent to good and evil, or worse, an evil God. That was Lewis's empirical view of the universe, and that's kind of the starting place of the play. So you get that, Lewis giving you, this is where I was mentally at a point in time when I began to change. And then he starts talking about what contributed to that. Well, my mother died when I was 9 of cancer. I prayed, nothing happened. Prayer doesn't work. It was his conclusion. And then he talks about his religious education, where there's 1,001 false religions and ours is completely true. And he says, on what grounds? So because he was a very smart boy and he was kind of a lout. He was, a big personality. His father was a huge personality. In addition to his mother passing of cancer, he had a terrible relationship with his father. Who Lewis regrets to the end of his life. He was involved in the butchery of World War I. So how could he come to any kind of other conclusion? It says there's a wonderful line that when he returned to Oxford, they read the minutes of their last meeting from 1914. He returned in 1919. They read the minutes of his last meeting from 1914. And he said, he said, never had I considered how big of a waste the whole experience was. And somebody asked him, it says, were you much frightened in France, meaning in the trenches? And he said, all the time, but I never sank so low as to pray.
Yeah. There's just, so much material to draw on, isn't there? And the way you weave it together in the film is just wonderful. I mean, what is it like for you when you step into those shoes? When you step into that personality, when you step into the costume? I mean, just when you started quoting, you were immediately turning on the C.S. Lewis just now. Do you feel like you yourself convert from Max McLean into something like C.S. Lewis?
Well, it's really a lot of fun to be that smart for 90 minutes. I mean, to be able to say those words, and to just get into that skin. I mean, obviously I respect him immensely. And so, it's almost like, the desire to be greater than you are, on so many levels. I mean, not the least of which, he took, the idea of right and wrong so seriously. Because he came to the conclusion that if the universe is just biochemistry and physics, then why should I be concerned about any kind of moral imperative? And yet he found that he was, and so he wanted to track that, and that I would say that the where he helps me the most is his honesty coming from this dead empiricism, which really leads nowhere, and yet intellectually he thought that was justified. Then going to this other place because there was something drawing him there. Some of it was the apologetic, I suppose, the dialectic of desire, the dialectic of reason. Those two things joined together were probably the biggest drivers to his conversion. And of course, that led him to just God, where he said, my religion was like that of the Jews. Yes. So he couldn't come to terms with Christ until a little bit later.
Well, we'll talk about that in the next segment of the show, because as has been shared in people like Alistair McGrath and others who've written extensively on Lewis, there was multiple stages, as it were, to his conversion. Bit of a special today. I'm joined by Max McLean. He's the founder and artistic director of the Fellowship of Performing Arts, and stars in and has been part of the screenplay and everything else, obviously, for this new film, The Most Reluctant Convert, directed by Norman Stone. If you want to find out more about it, cslewismovie.com. That's the best place to find out how you can watch it at your earliest convenience. It is showing in theatres across the US during November. But we'll be back in just a moment.
Hi, this is Sam from Premier Christianity. Would you like a free copy of the book that everyone is talking about right now? John Mark Comer's Live No Lies. I'm reading it myself and really enjoying it. You can get it when you subscribe to Premier Christianity magazine. You'll get the UK's leading Christian magazine delivered through your letterbox each and every month, plus this book. Take out the offer now at premierchristianity.com.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Hello and welcome back to this week's Profile. I'm Justin Brierley, bringing you today's show in partnership with Premier Christianity magazine, your monthly source of brilliant Christian journalism. You can get a free sample copy at premierchristianity.com/free sample and see the great subscription offer they're currently running. And today I'm in conversation with Max McLean, star of the new C.S. Lewis movie, The Most Reluctant Convert. Let's get a little taster of the film.
I never cared for my name, Clive Staples. The world came to know me as C.S. Lewis. Perhaps you read my books. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is the most famous, but there's one story that's not so well known. It's my story. And who better to tell it than me?
Max, tell us about the two other actors, key actors, because obviously this traces the journey through Lewis's life. You're there as sort of introducing, and then it's a beautiful way in which you weave yourself into the scenes with the other Lewises. It's very, very well done. But tell us about these other actors who, I think that the younger of which has gone on to become quite a name recently, haven't they?
Yes. So the structure of the film is we begin to live in Lewis's memories. Lewis is probably his age would be around 52, right around 1950. The reason we select 1950 is because it's pre-Narnia and it's pre-Joy Davidman. Both of those things are yet to come. But Lewis had already begun writing his autobiography, and he looks back on the time between 1908, when his mother died of cancer, when he was 9, to 1931, when he took communion for the first time since he was a child at Holy Trinity Church in Headington, just outside Oxford, Christmas in 1931. He was 32 years old. So that's the period. And so when he looks back, we cast two actors, introducing a marvelous boy actor to play the boy Lewis named Eddie Ray Martin, who's just so charming and kind of a bit of an urchin. He looks to me like what Lewis would look like at 9 years old. And of course, the struggles with his father come through, and the devastation of the loss of his mother comes through. Then by the time the story gets to about 16 years old, the actor changes to a young Lewis, the Lewis that goes off to war, the Lewis that becomes the young scholar at Oxford. And that's played by Nicholas Ralph, who's making a name for himself in Britain and in America as James Herriot in All Creatures Great and Small. And he's just marvelous as the young Lewis. And so the film goes back and forth into, and of course we cast the mother, the father. We have the great Knock, we have Tolkien, Dyson, and Barfield are all part of the movie.
That's the lovely thing. Lots of these characters who were so influential on Lewis are brought to life as well in the course of the film. You mentioned there his first communion, and I'd forgotten this from having obviously read it at some point in his memoirs and so on. But he regarded this as a terrible thing that he did to have gone through confirmation and communion without actually having believed any of it. I mean, just describe what Lewis says about this and why he felt so guilty afterwards about this.
Well, he said it was the worst act of his life. Sometimes let me see if I can actually find the words. The worst act of his life was.
Yes, do your best, C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, he said.
We'll get a taster here.
He says, I allowed myself to prepare for confirmation, be confirmed, and make my first communion all in total disbelief, acting a part, eating and drinking my own condemnation, he says. I knew I was acting a lie. I simply could not tell my father my real views. Not that he would have stormed. Let's talk the whole thing over, he would have said. But the thread would have been lost at once. Here again, he's talking about his relationship with his father. His arguments, I would not have valued a straw. The beauty of the authorized version, the Christian tradition. Oh, it was all sentiment. Nor could I, it was all sentiment. And if I tried to make my exact points clear, there would have been thunder from him and a thin, peevish rattle from me, nor could the whole subject ever have been dropped.
It's a great moment in the film. I really enjoyed that. I mean, what did you learn in the process of both creating the stage play and obviously doing the film about Lewis that perhaps you hadn't quite realised in before, having obviously been a fan of Lewis for some time up to that point?
Well, the thing I think everybody discovers with Lewis is you never get to the bottom of him. That's why people keep coming back to him. It's a bottomless pit. mostly because his intellect and his emotion are so tied together. That's why it makes it really work theatrically. It all combines. So it's not like he's just a head, where so many academics are, or he's just this, just all emotion where, he brings it all together. And I think, and he's so transparent. I've always been kind of struggling because he was a very private person that just shouted from the rooftops his most private thoughts.
Yeah, it's a strange kind of contradiction in terms, isn't it? But I know exactly what you mean. He wasn't an extrovert exactly, but he was incredibly transparent when it came to his actual writing and very honest, about his shortcomings and everything else. Let's talk about the conversion itself, because obviously that's at the center of this film. Mm-hmm. And what many people don't realize is that this was a multi-stage journey that Lewis went on. Do you want to just describe what those stages were and how you bring them out in the film?
Yeah, it's a little tough, Lewis when he describes it in Pilgrim's Regress, or he said it was, he thought that his conversion was from atheism to idealism to pantheism to theism. He says he thought that it was a conversion a lot of people went through. He says nobody goes through it like that. He says it was like he compared it to somebody's travels through the Gobi Desert as being as obvious to the general public as the rail from Oxford to London. And so he starts with atheism and then idealism, and that sort of happens with Barfield. It's like are your moral and aesthetic is your moral and aesthetics valid, meaningful? He says they are. Is logic? Does logic and deduction lead to indisputable truth? He says it does. Mm. So Barfield says then, well, your materialism has to be abandoned because otherwise it's all your materialism says that you have to trust your mind, and you can't. It's all biochemistry and physics, and that just. Lewis was shocked by that because his reasoning was it's all natural selection, random mutation, allowing humans to have a reproductive advantage over other species.
You kind of represent this in the film as this conversation that happens in Lewis's rooms between himself and Barfield, but what it was, I recently reread Miracles by Lewis, and it was all chiming with that, obviously. So, but are you saying that really it was Barfield who first kind of put those ideas in his head? That he was the originator of
at least challenged him. I think they were already there, but they challenged him because, he didn't want to have anything to do with the supernatural. He had something called the New Look, which was to just be, just the straight and narrow, don't do anything that's out there in the theological world, the supernatural world. Because he also had a taste for the occult, which was something that I didn't know. So he's dabbling, and I guess Barfield allowed him to ground it into reality. I think he makes a very famous statement in Surprised by Joy, that he said that my first step was to abandon the absurd notion that the universe is an arbitrary alternative to nothingness. That was the first step. And that led him to an idealism that God is out there. If Hamlet and Shakespeare could ever meet, it would have to be Shakespeare's doing. In Lewis's original experience, Shakespeare's way out there and Hamlet's down here, they never meet. And he says, but what if Shakespeare wrote himself into the play? And that's where it became more theistic for him. Theistic in the sense of the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In one sense, he says, my God was like the God of the Jews. And he couldn't come to terms with Jesus until much, much later, and particularly through that walk without a step.
Well, let's get this in place then, because obviously the title of the film and the stage play comes from a very well-known passage in Lewis's, I think it is, Surprised by Joy, where he talks about one particular night in his rooms in Oxford when he's in turmoil and he feels like God has been chasing him down until finally he relents and kneels and prays. At that point, the most dejected and reluctant convert in the whole of England. Now, what is he actually at that point converting to? Because it becomes apparent, I think, in the film that he starts to go to church at that point. He starts to sort of take on, if you like, wants to do something to
fly his flag, he says.
Yeah, fly his flag. But it doesn't feel like he's kind of embraced at that point full-bodied Christianity. Is that fair to say?
No, but what's very interesting is he embraces full-bodied theism. That God is real, that God is God, that he owes his allegiance to the God who made the universe. He just can't. And so to you and I, who grew up in the Christian tradition, we immediately apply a Christian interpretation of that. But he said that I knew nothing of the incarnation. The God to whom I served was not human. That's, but it was, but he did not think the universe was arbitrary. He thought the universe was purposeful, and he owed his allegiance to his creator. So in a certain sense, he gives tremendous support to theism. And I think we sort of discount that a little too much.
Yes. It's just so interesting, though, because there's these various moments. There's one thing where he's on a bus and he says, by the time I walked off the bus, I'd decided in my mind that God existed. And then you've got this sort of more kind of
that's the motorcycle ride.
Yeah, that's it, the motorcycle ride. But all of these various experiences but then it's shot so very well. There is this famous walk again on in the grounds of Magdalen College, isn't it? With another very, very well-known writer, J.R.R. Tolkien. So describe what this is, where you find this in Lewis's own memoirs, and how it's represented in the film. But what the big point of this particular conversation was.
Well, first of all, we have to kind of set up the fact that this is J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, two people on Mount Olympus, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Just regular, everyday colleagues at Oxford in 1931, hadn't written anything of any import at that time. Who knew what they were going to be? They're having a conversation that pretty much revolutionized the spiritual map of the world from that point on. The key issue was that Lewis sort of admitted to Tolkien that I have, with great reluctance, come to believe in God, but not Christianity, he said. And that's a key point, because he couldn't understand how the life and death of someone else, whoever he was 2,000 years ago, could help him or anyone else here and now. He just didn't get it. Didn't understand the Christian revelation at all. And Tolkien takes a completely different path that really is quite extraordinary. He uses Lewis's, they shared a common interest in mythology. And he says, and so Tolkien asks him, when you meet a god that sacrifices himself in a pagan story, and they're all over the place in pagan history, Balder, Dionysius, Osiris, all over the place, Tolkien reminds him, you like it very much and are mysteriously moved by it, provided you meet it anywhere except the Gospels. And then he makes the point out, the story of Christ is a myth, working on us in the same way as other myths, with one tremendous difference. It really happened. It's the myth in which all the other myths point. It's the true myth behind all the myths. And for some reason, I mentioned earlier about when that person said, Jesus was a person just like Lincoln, just like George Washington. That was a kind of moment for Lewis, because it made him read the Bible differently. read the Gospels differently. Because in the past he was probably reading it as a textbook, looking for prescription, But here he was reading the story of a hero, the archetypal hero, where he saw as Jordan Peterson would say, the worst possible thing happen to the best possible person. And it changed it, because now he had to come to terms with Jesus, and in all this, all of his apologetics about Jesus then come to light after that moment.
It's a really interesting one, because obviously up to that point it had been a very intellectual journey, arguably. At this point it feels like his imagination steps into that worldview, and suddenly a penny drops, and it's as though, yes, this is what I was waiting for. This is why because we all know that Lewis, was a huge fan, got so much joy out of the mythologies and everything that he was, a scholar of. And I think it was this point that he realized it's real, that it's not just I'm enjoying fantasy, it's that the fantasy becomes real in Jesus. There's this sort of touch point with reality where I don't have to be an atheist materialist over here while simply enjoying this other world that somehow bears no relation to it. No, these two worlds have come together. And that's that. I think you do that so well in the book. I feel a bit like, Tolkien had his own movie out not so long ago, and that really underplayed, frankly, his Catholic faith. I feel like we need a Norman Stone version of the Tolkien story
of that. As well. Yeah, that could happen.
Who knows? Who knows? Look, why does Lewis remain so phenomenally influential and indeed popular, especially in the USA? I mean, he's obviously still a great name here in the UK, but if it's often out of the US actually that I'm hearing the most. 50 years on from his death, people are still wanting to write, film, talk about Lewis. What's the enduring appeal there, Max?
I've been thinking about this more recently, in many ways, listening to some of your programs, because I think Lewis is a bridge from the postmodern world that we're all steeped in, that we're educated in, which basically says here we have to live for the here and now, and there's very little concern about this other world. And Lewis is always talking about this other world. And he makes that other world so compelling. Part of it is, he didn't have a formal theological education, so he comes to theology from a literary perspective. He read everything from the Greeks to the moderns. He had a steel-trap mind that could recall everything he said. He had this extraordinary ability to translate that into magnificent prose and speech. I think arguably he's one of the greatest writers who ever lived. Certainly in terms of the kind of writing, reading that I've done. And I've read all of Shakespeare. I've read a lot of Dostoevsky. I've read less and less of moderns because they just don't do anything for me anymore. But I just find that he allows me to go places supernaturally, imaginatively, theologically that I don't get to any other way.
Yeah, and I think that's. I as you know, I work in the world of apologetics, and we try and find creative ways of bringing it across. But Lewis was had that supreme ability to use the imagination and creativity through the written word to do that, whether it was Screwtape or Narnia or the Space Trilogy or whatever it was. He seemed to understand what actually was the winning combination, if you will, of bringing the intellect and the imagination together. I think that's what you've done with this film as well, if I dare to say that. I think it's a wonderful way in which you're in that tradition. But sadly, apologetics as a whole tends to remain very one-sided. It's almost entirely an intellectual pursuit, and too often it's divorced from the arts, from the imagination. I mean, do you feel like that's going to change? Do you feel like we're heading in the right direction? Because I feel like we need another C.S. Lewis, or we all need to become a little bit more like C.S. Lewis.
Well, I do think that's true, but there was a quote, I think it was Austin Farrar, and I'm going to paraphrase it from memory, but he essentially says, see if I can find it, that in fact it's if you can bear with me, it's probably worth finding because it comes at I'm writing a new play called Further Up, Further In. It's going to be developed next year, and he tells a wonderful story about, he says, I do suffer from an incurable intellectualism. I love that. He says, of course, the direct evangelical appeal, come to Jesus, is still remarkably effective. He says, I've seen it done. I love that. I've seen it done. He says, I can't do it, but those who can ought to do with all their might. And he tells a story about a vicar who once asked him to make such an appeal at an RAF meeting during the war. And he said to him, I wish I could do the heart stuff. You do the heart stuff. I'll do the head stuff. But in this, I was quoting Austin Farrar. He says, it's not that rational arguments create belief. He says, I don't believe that. He says, on the other hand, I do think the lack of it destroys conviction. And this is the key point. What is proved may not be embraced, but what no one defends is soon abandoned. I was really struck by that because, we do get a little bit discouraged, by the apologetic enterprise, but we can't stop it. Because I think this last point, and this is something Lewis believed, but what no one defends is soon abandoned. And that's what's happened at the American University. It's not that they think Christianity is nefarious. They think it's irrelevant. And so nobody defends it. The case is not made, right? It's assumed. So it's really important.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's been such fun talking to you, Max, and getting to spend some time just reliving, Lewis and the process that has come to be with this film. Now, you've got some screenings throughout November, haven't you, in the USA? What's the best way? cslewismovie.com?
Yeah, cslewismovie.com. I mean, right now it's only in America, although we just opened up 43 screens in Canada. This is way beyond me. We work with all the movie chains, and but it's I'm really happy to say tickets are really moving fast, which does mean that if it's moving fast, then the movie chains and those people the powers that be will open it up to worldwide release after our American release. So I do think that, and particularly because the subject matter is so evergreen, that I do think it's going to have a long life.
Yeah. Well, whenever you're listening to this show, just check at cslewismovie.com and you'll find out what the best way is for where you are to be able to access the film. I mean, does this mean the Fellowship of Performing Arts is moving generally in the direction of movie and video, Max?
I think so. In fact, Norman and I are reading many scripts to look at what's the next film that we want to do. I mean, we're always going to be a theater company. In fact, we have The Great Divorce on stage right now. I mentioned briefly that I'm working on a new script that's a follow-up, because after Lewis's conversion, it wasn't really obvious that he would become the person he became. So what were the steps that led to that? And so the next piece is called Further Up, Further In, which I'm very, very excited about.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, what I was left with at the end of the film was thinking, but we've only just got to the point just before he really takes off now. There's a whole other story. And obviously others have told parts of that story in Shadowlands and other things. But I wait with bated breath to see what you may have in store, Max. Max McLean, thank you so much for being with me. It's been such fun catching up, and all the very best as you continue to promote the film. I hope many people see it and benefit from it.
Thank you so much, Justin.
It's been great to have you on. Again, if you want to find out more about the film, do just go to the website, cslewismovie.com. I'll make sure there's a link from today's show so that you can find out more about it. And I highly recommend it. I spent the evening the other night with Lucy watching it, and we both really, really enjoyed it. So go and check it out if you can. Thanks for listening to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio this week. You can catch the podcast anytime over at our website, premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. And do check out Premier Christianity magazine as well. See you next time.